Hello. If you watched my previous devlog on my airborne farming simulator, you might remember that I briefly mentioned that I created a new sprite for the player's house, which has been essentially unchanged in months. It's a simple design, but I'm really happy with how it turned out, so I'd like to share more of the process involved in its creation. The first thing I did was create an outline. This wasn't too difficult, since I had a pretty good idea of how its dimensions should be, though I did slim it down a bit for my first attempt. The roof is notable because it points to the sides, which I think looks more visually interesting and leaves more space for the wall texture. The specific angle of the roof doesn't really matter, so I used a 2:1 ratio line, which is nice and uniform and produces an angle that looks about right. I then filled in all of the shapes with basic colors so that I had an idea of how the final house might look. There's no particular reason that I chose these colors, other than just that I think they look nice together and aren't too garish. From there, I moved on to the front door, which I figured would be the next easiest part to work on. I added the frame, the handle, the weird recessed panel things, and the window, not forgetting the highlights. To get the proportions right, I looked at some reference photos of real-life front doors, which helped a good amount. I then began work on the stone wall, which ended up being the part I spent the most amount of time trying to get right. In my first texture attempt, the 16 by 16 tile contained 2 bricks, which I found to be too large and flat. To fix the size issue, I could have halved the height of the bricks, but I knew that then it would be too small. Instead, I decided to change the size of the tile to 16 by 12, which is a scale I preferred much more. It's no longer a perfect square, but since it's only being used within a single sprite, that's honestly not much of an issue anyway. This second attempt is much more visually noisy and has bricks of different widths. I really liked how the varying widths looked, but I found the noisiness too distracting, so in the third attempt I toned it down much more and also added brightness variation. Once again, I really liked the brightness variation, but I realized that any noise at all doesn't really produce the look I'm going for, so in the fourth and final attempt I removed it completely. I also added a lot more detailed shading to enhance the stone's smoothness and compactness. Something I found surprising is that whether or not the few pixels on the bottoms of the bricks were dark actually had a big impact on the end result, with fully dark edges appearing like large gaps, and edges with a bit of lightness making the stones appear tightly packed and almost bulging out. The latter gave exactly the effect I was looking for, and as there were no other problems, I finally settled on using this texture for the wall. This left only the roof remaining. I started by making a square tiling pattern I liked, and mapped it to the shape of the roof by adding steps corresponding to the edges. I specifically chose to add the texture after mapping the shape so that I had a better impression of how the end result would look. This time I did make it noisy because it's a roof, of course it is. I then added a front edge to show that it's not paper thin. Now all that was missing was some finishing touches to the shading, so I made the right half of the roof brighter, added a shadow under the front to show that it overhangs, and also added very thin shadows around the edges of the wall and next to the door frame. And that's the house. Of course, it's a bit simple, and I could always add extra details like a chimney or more windows or whatever, but I'm really happy with how it looks, and I think it fits very well in the sky-themed environment. Especially when you compare it to the shop design I made a while ago, I think it's clear that the attention to detail goes a long way in making the final result much more appealing. Now, as an extra, I'd also like to show off the inside of the house. It's not much at the moment, as it's still a work in progress, but there's a few interesting things to see here. There's a desk with a notebook on it, a bed, and a lot of floor space. The most difficult sprite for me to work on was the bed, since I haven't actually drawn many cloth-like objects while working on this game. Still, I think I did a decent job. You can see that there's a lot of thin shadows on the surface to make it look lumpy, and overhanging the front, a lot of V-shapes that are characteristic of cloth-like materials. Something unique about the bed's behavior is that you actually use it by jumping on it. It's a small detail, but I figured that in a game that so prominently features jumping, it would be a missed opportunity not to include. So that covers just about everything. I hope you learned something interesting, and maybe have a better idea of how you can draw pixel art houses. Thanks for watching. Bye.